Greetings, brothers and sisters. Casual readers of Orwell's dystopian classic may not recall that one key event that led to the rise of INGSOC was the so-called atomic war that rocked the world in the 1950s. Yes, 1984 had its own World War III. As with most things in Orwell's world, however, details are vague at best on exactly when and how this began. Using law evidence, my task today is to give you an answer to both of these questions. One past interpretation I've had was that this conflict could have arisen as a result of the rise of Eurasia itself, though a close reading of Goldstein's book would seem to suggest otherwise. On exactly who started the conflict, the key part of the book is in Part 1, Chapter 3. Here Winston reminisces about his past and the history of his society as he knows it. In particular, he recalls one of his earliest memories, that of an air raid or an attack in which he, his father and mother, all had to hurry into an underground shelter, actually a tube station. Winston was very young, but he distinctly remembers an old man talking about events. The man was distraught and slightly drunk, his eyes blue and full of tears. Winston recalls how he felt he knew what was the matter, that the man had suffered a loss of a loved one, perhaps a little granddaughter, and was muttering continuously to himself how we didn't ought to have trusted the buggers. Which buggers the man was referring to escapes Winston's recall, though law evidence makes it pretty clear. Winston's memory makes it plain that this was a surprise attack, and perhaps the beginning of the more familiar, endless conflict we see in the novel. The old man's language supports this, that there had been some kind of compact with the attacking power, hence the trust that was broken. Winston too also thinks this may have been around the same time, if not the exact same time, that Colchester was nuked too. Tie into this Winston's description of the raid as an early memory, and we could opt for the earliest years of 1948 or 1949. However, this seems a little too early, especially given Winston also recalls in the passage that there had been a fairly lengthy period of peace during his childhood, which doesn't fit with this early estimation, as he had barely had any childhood up to that point. Surprisingly, and perhaps rather confusingly, Winston himself provides a clarifying bit of information in another scene of the book that really pins down the year for us. As with a lot of information about the world, it's a blink and you'll miss it reference, so to speak. In Part 2, Chapter 3, Winston describes he and his lover meeting in the belfry of a ruined church. It's located somewhere in the country outside of London. Crucially, he explains that an atomic bomb had been dropped there 30 years before. This, of course, working back from the titular year of the novel, gives us the year of 1954. Given its nature, any nuclear conflict could not have been long-lasting. We know from Goldstein's book later on that hundreds of bombs were chiefly dropped in North America, Western Europe, and European Russia. Assuming the world's timeline is somewhat similar to ours, we can assume it would have taken a few years for the major powers pre-party to have built up their initial stockpiles. In 1945, we know the USA just had 2 bombs, which they used in Japan. 1954 then, as the year of World War III, makes a lot of sense in terms of giving the USSR and other powers the time to develop and build their own arsenals. The first successful Soviet bomb was tested in 1949, which means at least that they had 3 or 4 years to build up their stockpile. Orwell, remember, would have been perfectly aware of the geopolitical situation at the time of writing, that the 2 major powers were the USA and USSR, so we can safely assume this was what he had in mind when he envisaged the major powers of the atomic war described in the book. The clincher for who started the conflict in the book is actually indirectly answered in Goldstein's book. Though a fabrication of O'Brien and others, the former does say that the descriptive elements of it are true, that only the suggested means of overthrowing the party is nonsense. In Goldstein's book, the atomic war is described as having taken place in the 1950s, corroborating Winston's more specific comment earlier. However, crucially too, we see a casual transition take place in the description of events. Quote, "The effect of the war was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of organised society and hence of their own power. Thereafter, although no formal agreement was ever made or hinted at, no more bombs were dropped. All three powers merely continued to produce atomic bombs and store them up. So did you catch it? Notice how the description goes from describing the participants of the atomic war as countries to later switching to just the three powers producing, storing but not using bombs. This answers our question of who, or in any event, who probably started the war at least. Since the aforementioned quote makes clear the countries of the world still existed at the time, this narrows things down to just one likely perpetrator. We know that the attack was unexpected and sudden, that peace had reigned for a decent period, and that the old man bitterly lamented trusting the attackers. For me, this screams the USSR. For a start, the time frame fits very well. This would give the Soviets, in Orwell's mind I suspect, enough time to develop their own nuclear technology. The Soviets, by the time of writing, would have been the clear aggressor, or at least rival, to the US-dominated free world, and the whole betrayal thing could simply come from the fact that, at the time, many would have considered the Soviets allies from their time fighting the mutual bad guys in the war. We're also talking about an old prole here. He would have lived through the war at home, and unlike our vaunted historical hindsight, which sees Stalin as a brutal dictator, back then, especially during the war years, he was simply Uncle Joe, an ally against the Germans. It's easy to see why the old man would see such an attack as a betrayal then, and it makes the most sense. Other options could be a US attack, which seems odd considering the UK was firmly allied to and dependent upon the USA during and after the war years. We know, of course, that the United States did absorb the British Empire, but it's not clear, or likely even, that this happened before the atomic war. Another suggestion I've heard is that it could have been a false flag, that is, the government, perhaps even the party itself, nuked Colchester and other areas in 1954. We know that the party was in power by 1958 at the latest, if we accept the 9 3-year plans chronology discussed in my previous video on when the party came to power. Yet there's a couple of problems with this. For a start, I'm sceptical that the party or revolution actually began in the UK to begin with. Given the greater power and reach of the US, it's far more likely it began there and spread, later culminating in the amalgamation of the States and British Empire. I don't know this, of course, but it makes more sense than Britain somehow conquering the US, which is ridiculous if you know even a minimal amount about the historic context. By the way, I'm saying all of this as a proud Englishman myself, so I have no pro-American bias, indeed quite the opposite in this regard. Another problem is that the chronology suggests the party came after the war, along with the eventual settling into the familiar free superpower situation of the novel. Winston in the air raid chapter references the confused fighting in the streets of London after the war, which Winston says settled into the familiar pattern after the air raid. This clearly suggests that the revolution took place or spread to London afterwards then, which means the party could not have nuked Colchester or anywhere else for that matter. So to finish up, it's interesting to consider why the war happened. We know it was around 1954, but for exactly how long is not exactly known. We know based on the law, history and common sense that it's highly likely the USSR struck Colchester and began the war, but is there a likely reason why? The following is speculation on my part, so if that's not your thing, then you may wish to turn your telescreen down. That being said, my working theory is that though WW2 went roughly the same in this world, I'm guessing it went rather better for the Soviets than in our timeline. There are many scenarios which could have allowed this, for example, a failed or delayed D-Day, or no American involvement in Europe at all. Or perhaps, related to this, the defeat of Britain in 1940, or the destruction of its army at Dunkirk. It suffices to say that somehow the Soviets pushed much further into Western Europe after the fall of Berlin, which unnerved the Anglo-Americans. This actually makes sense in a way, as we know this effectively happened anyway in the law, as Eurasia is simply the Soviet amalgamation with Western Europe. If Eurasia indeed formed first in the late 1940s or very early 1950s, the presence of this massive and aggressive superpower could have prompted the American takeover of the British Empire, if not yet quite officially forming Oceania. Of course, one major problem with all of this is that Goldstein's book clearly references countries still existing during the atomic war, though this is quite a loose word, and could mean anything from the countries we all know to just a handful of remaining great powers, so who knows? The best we can say is that in this timeline then, the early Cold War turned decisively hot. Perhaps Soviet gains, while not at Eurasian levels, were enough to prompt the US to become more aggressive, sparking the war. Perhaps a Checkpoint Charlie type situation blew up on the continent. However it happened, it's very likely the atomic war was began by the USSR in around 1954. Since Great Britain is geographically a part of Europe, perhaps the Soviets sought to nuke them into submission, much like the US did with Japan. Though the old man was surprised in Winston's memory, perhaps he was referring to all the major powers as a group, that he trusted them all to keep the peace. It's possible too then that the US may have struck first, and the Soviets merely retaliated. What do you all think anyway? Do you have another theory about when and who started the atomic war of 1984? Write your thoughts and objections in the comments section. And remember, we are at war with Eurasia. We have always been at war with Eurasia.